Welcome back to episode 1 of the Service Management Social. This week, we're looking at PR for service management, and joining us is Amy Gavin, David Barrow, Rob York, and Simon Reeves. This is part 3, so if you didn't get an opportunity to tune in yesterday or on Monday, please check these out following the links below. Okay, so moving straight on to it with our next topic, which today is around managing business risk through good service management. So business risks can materialize into loss of business, breaches in security, and potential closure of a business in extreme circumstances. However, a balanced and appropriate maturity of service management can reduce and mitigate these risks. What service level or what levels of service management are required to meet these risks in the coming months and moving into the new year? So let's start with Simon on this one.
I love risk. Risk is one of my favorite subjects. So I suppose I flip the question and say, who has KRIs in their IT service management function? So we talked about in episode 2 yesterday, user experience and XLAs. We talked about SLAs. We probably want to talk about underpinning contracts, but not many people talk about KRIs, key risk indicators. And I think they're really, really useful from an ITSM perspective. Predicting risk and managing and mitigating that risk is crucial. So I would suggest we need to truly start looking at effective KRIs and looking at KPIs and SLAs that predict risk in the future. So as an example, is my mean time to resolution on my major incidents meeting its SLA? Yes, tick. However, is the mean time to resolution increasing? And that is implying that the risk profile and the length of the availability is increasing. Is my unauthorized changes, my failed changes in appetite at the moment? Yes, but it's slowly increasing month on month. And that shows that we have loosening controls of our change process. So I'd look to establish some really robust KRIs for each process area and then probably amalgamate it in like some form of critical success factor. That's quite a technical answer, sorry, but I quite like this subject.
Yeah.
So I suppose with that then specifically, who's your say target audience when you're promoting KRIs? Is it risk managers, security personnel within IT? Is it people on the business side, business continuity people? Is it who essentially would you be promoting KRIs to? Where are you going to get that investment from?
So I think it depends on the organizational maturity. So you might have a first line, second line, third line of defense, internal audit, external audit, one of the big 4. But you can use it locally. So you can maintain a risk register and KRIs locally within a team to drive service improvement plans locally. They're not something that need to be published necessarily widely, but I think it really depends on the organization. To your point around the investment, I don't think they need any investment. Truly, really, they're just SLAs represented in a forward-looking posture. And so you're taking SLAs and you're predicting what the future will occur, which is essentially risk management.
And do you see, this is kind of a question to you all actually, I mean, do you see the kind of the ownership and governance of those better sat with an individual team within service management, or do you see it better sat with sort of technical teams themselves, kind of managing their own risk and their own KRIs, sort of setting them and also kind of governing themselves against them?
Box and hen house comes to mind.
Everyone should manage their own risks, and there should be a consolidated view of risk across teams, functions, and organizations.
Do you see a difference in, say, KRIs or kind of indicators that allow you to assess risk within financial services being different to in insurance, to different in kind of e-com or whatever else for that matter? I mean, if we look at if we look at retail, Rob, I mean, I suppose looking at Newell again specifically, a very kind of, I wouldn't say disparate setting, but certainly unofficially fairly federated, do say US teams or the business in the US see things differently or risk differently to how perhaps it's seen in the UK? And would you say that one retailer is seeing it differently to the next retailer, and is retail seeing it differently to perhaps another industry sector? So a lot of questions.
Right. So I think there's globalization, and in an organization, I mean, The organization we sold to customers, the customers sold to the end consumer. And it's interesting from the risk perspective that quite a few years ago, but a view was traditionally that, if all the systems fail, we just ship everybody what we shipped last time and we'll sort it out later. And that was kind of the continuity plan to go, because we'll just sort it out. Obviously, with the digital age and everything else and how organizations moving into e-com, I think a different view is required. But yes, there are different levels, I think, on a global scale to risk. Some cultures are much easier to take risk and, shall we say, fail fast and spin again. Whereas other organizations and cultures, more importantly, and I think Europe and maybe the UK falls into this, is a more cautious approach to how things are done. And therefore, from that perspective, is how do you align and how do you take that forward? So I think to Simon's point of having risk KPIs is important, because you bring that back to the business as a whole. And therefore, to get everybody onto that and realizing globalization and everything else, there is an important here on commonality, and risk is important. But from what I've seen, obviously financial, I would say, would be very different. But if FMCG, it was almost like we can just keep going and we'll see.
With different kind of territories, countries, regions having different kind of external kind of compliances, legislation, and so on, surely that drives the culture itself and how you approach or how seriously you take risk. Is that a fair point?
Yes, because I think I had sort of like governance risk responsibility for compliancy in the EMEA region, and that didn't apply in North America. But then you have such things as the Sarbanes-Oxley situation and Enron and everything else. So there are different levels in organizations of what apply. And I think when you bring that back to IT and delivering, it's getting out of a culture that kind of looks at it, well, where I am, we're okay, that's your problem. And suddenly we create an us and them within teams from a compliancy perspective. And then, of course, you bring service management to the table, saying we're trying to look at a solution for the organization here that's going to work. And I think, as Amy mentioned on one of the previous podcasts we did, it is therefore aligning this and getting the business to agree we are one. And that used to be one of the mottos, we're one, and within technical teams, so that we have a combined way of working. Otherwise, we all end up disparate situations, disparate solutions, and not my problem comes to mind. And that definitely, I think, as we've already said on the social side, is not the way forward today.
Amy, do you see a synergy or a relationship between XLAs and KRIs for your business?
Well, that's a difficult one. That is a difficult one. I think I might see a synergy, but whether our end users see a synergy or not is different, because from my consumer and my customer perspective, as long as they're getting the services they need, which is where the XLA comes in, they're really happy. Like you, Simon, I love risk. I find risk really interesting. Risk management is one of my favorite things. So I know I'm a geek, but it's so we do a lot of KRIs. I do a lot of risk reporting within my team, specifically now, but I am trying to push that out to wider teams. And the easiest way I've done that to start with is by making sure when we're doing problem management, like traditional problem management, that we're risk assessing that problem. So before we decide whether we're going to fix it, it's not just about the cost, it's about the risk to the business. What are these risks? How are they, what is the impact if this keeps happening, etc. So it's helping us, and it's bringing this risk management to the forefront of people's minds, which I think is working really well. And it has opened people's eyes to risk. I think, does it have a direct impact on XLAs? Well, potentially, in terms of if we're doing it properly and you're reducing the risk of things happening and you're reducing a risk of a data leak or a finance breach or whatever else, then absolutely. But I think it's very indirect in terms of what the end user perceives.
David, have you seen or been in situations where there has been a close alignment, given some of the engagements you've been involved in, and as Amy alluded to there, I suppose, if we use a data breach as an example, doesn't necessarily have to be that, well, where something, business critical has an immediate impact on the people working within that organization due to, press and external pressures or higher kind of inbound calls or whatever else it may be. I mean, have you got examples of where you've seen a close relationship between the two?
Yeah, I have two, one old and one fairly new. So the old one was, I once had a role where I had one prevailing target, which was to keep this particular, we'll call it an organization, off the front page of the Daily Mail. And that organization, it's a government organization, government department, basically could not afford for its key service to fail at a key time of the year for self-employed people, because it would end up on the front page of the Daily Mail. So in terms of how that impacted the consumer and the risk, that meant my risk profile and my ability to take risk was low, which meant the ability to innovate was low, which therefore meant the ability to innovate in line with the consumer requirement was also low, and therefore essentially impacted upon their experience. So that's the first time I really saw that. Fast forwarding, I've worked last year for a business that is going from a very much a sort of a B2B to a B2C, but they are heavily influenced by legislation and competition. And going back to earlier points, their legislation changes depending on where they are in the world, based on their product. So therefore, they have to take appropriate risk within those regions. Consumers have certain wants and requirements, but again, they're not necessarily able to innovate in line with the rest of the world because legislation stops them from doing so. And that's a risk. Another risk for a business that's going B2C is competition. So if a new business comes in and is able to steamroller into your sector and has a much less risk averse approach and is able in their mind to innovate, they can take your business. So when you're looking at risk, you need to understand your environment, and that extends to legislation, competition, and your partners, as an example. And those three things, going back to Amy's point, would probably make no sense to those whose experience you're measuring, but how you adapt to those things can improve or reduce that experience.
Yeah.
And I think in one of the earlier podcasts, Simon said, the business and the consumers don't really care how we organize ourselves, and they don't, and he's correct. But those elements can materially impact how we're able to organize ourselves and innovate, and therefore will impact on the consumer, hopefully in the positive manner, but it can easily go the other way.
And just taking that, David, one of the things I think through effective risk management is it could be a great opportunity to sell your organization, to be able to work with other organizations. So many businesses won't consume services now unless you're ISO 27001 accredited.
Yes.
And that in itself is a business enabler. So through effective security risk management, you're enabling a kind of greater opportunity to market. I think one of the other things we've not really mentioned is about how we pass risk out of the internal organization to partnering. So partnering is a form of risk management. You're reducing and potentially increasing your risk through partnering and outsourcing. You're potentially reducing your cost risk, but you're maybe questioning your quality risk. Yeah. And they're the kind of things that you need to kind of manage those levels in service management.
So using that, Simon, as an example, if you are looking to outsource a service per se, where does the responsibility of consulting a business unit that has, lots of kind of, I don't know, sensitive data hypothetically sit? Does it sit with service architecture? Does it sit with the people doing the kind of the SDP for that outsourcing? Is it with the service managers that are interacting with them most frequently on an ongoing basis to understand what those are and feeding those back into service architect or service design and transition or wherever it may be?
I think it's interesting. I think it depends on the type of service you're looking to buy, and whether it's a commodity outsourced service, that's kind of an off the shelf where you're agreeing to an end user licensing agreement. David will talk probably more about that with his ITAM knowledge and kind of assets, or whether you're looking at a material managed service partner, materially delivering a managed service agreement for the next 5 years, and different levels of outsource will require different types of kind of governance at board level for a 5-year MSA, and especially the impact it can have politically. At EBRD and IT, we've gone through kind of a first generation outsource, and obviously that type of thing is organizationally quite changing. So you have various stakeholders that would be involved in approving that, but many other organizations, FTSE 100, 250, it's bread and butter outsourcing, and it's something that they do on a day-to-day basis.
So would it be fair to say that when you're going through something similar to what you've just highlighted there, Simon, in kind of first gen outsourcing programs, or where the business is going through such significant change, it's a nuance for everyone involved on the business side anyway, to highlight the risk proactively to the business, or essentially should you kind of just manage and kind of trickle in that knowledge of where the risk lies during that program?
Yeah, I'd say it's less about managing the risk and managing organizational change management, OCM. So how the organization is on that change journey. Risk should be managed with appropriate stakeholders. I don't think users should be worried about the risk passing between organizations. They should be worried about how it impacts them and how it enables them.